what do you guys work on? What is it?
Yeah, so to understand that, I actually want to go back to like sort of the start of TurboTax, which is, I mean, TurboTax is kind of neat because like it's a really old product by comparison to a lot of software. When you think about the fact that TurboTax, like the first version, was a Microsoft DOS application, it's kind of crazy. And the fact that it runs on like iOS and Android, and there's like still code now that is running that has those like copyright lines that were really popular back in the day, and it's like copyright 1985 Chipsoft, and I'm like, huh, that's before I was born. The thing that's crazy about it is like we've still got code that's running that's that old, but TurboTax is always evolving. And what's really neat is that there's been like a couple major evolutions over the course of the time that TurboTax has been around. I think the first one was when it obviously went to Windows and Mac, and it went from like being a very forms centric experience to being more of like a Windows 95 style wizard where it's like next, 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 done. Doing your taxes is as easy as installing a video game. And then they took that and they brought it to the web, and then they took that and they brought it to mobile. But of course, across each one of these platforms, we really want like a best-in-class native experience. And so in order to manage tens of thousands of screens of tax logic and asking users about like, were you married? Are you filing single? Were you serving in the military last year? Do you want to donate to the presidential campaign fund? All of those things are really not engineering like problems. We really want those things to be handled by tax experts, right? Because they're the ones with like the best knowledge to ask those questions. And so what we've done over the course of the last couple of decades that TurboTax has existed is create this platform agnostic way of representing these screens, these what we call interview screens. And the latest iteration of this is what we call the player. And the player is the core piece of technology that we have that handles all of our user experiences in TurboTax. So that's what we've been working on, especially over the last year and a half. We've made a real investment in taking what we built several years ago, like 5 or 6 years ago, and sort of reinventing it for how we want to do development today, not only in TurboTax, but also taking it and applying it in other areas like Mint and QuickBooks that the company also has.
Yeah, and then recently it's been a lot of the cross-platform work has really been kind of some of the cool stuff. So getting the same content working from web to the iOS app and making it actually legitimately native and not just an embedded web view, and getting a different look and feel depending on what platform you're on and who you're talking to and all that stuff.
Could you talk a little bit about like what the primitives look like? This is a problem over my career that I've seen a lot, is like we have some data and we need to display it on many different platforms. It's like a common product problem. Tools like GraphQL have evolved to sort of like meet that in a way. And of course, before that, we have had many different sort of API interfaces to handle this. But I'm curious, like, what is the sort of like fundamental structure of the player? What does it consume? Is this just like a data document of some sort that's like describes like what questions and like what the flow is, or like what does that look like?
As you can imagine, there's a bunch of different moving parts. What we consider the player is kind of the end UI piece of it. And it's really this culmination of this semantic JSON that we kind of describe the questions we want to ask. So a good example is like if I'm asking you to pick from A, B, or C, UI-wise, that could be a drop-down. It could be a bunch of radio buttons. It could be some tiles that you pick from. Might be different depending on how many questions there are. Is it the only question on the page, or is it in a form? Are you a pro user versus someone first time filing? All the different context goes into like how we can actually paint the pixels on the page to make it so you pick one of those three options. But at the end of the day, like the tax people, the tax logic doesn't care how you picked it. It just wants, did you do A, B, or C? So the player's kind of that last mile of the semantic. How do we actually take you making a choice between those three, and what's the best way to paint the pixels on whatever platform you are, depending on the user and everything else around it, any other context we can gather.
Yeah, it would really defeat the purpose if like, a tax expert had to be like, oh, I want to put a UI button here for iOS, but then on the web, I've got my React TurboTax button. And for them to know that would just be pointless. And like Adam said, there's like this semantic layer where it's like, take an action, present the user a choice, ask them for some input, show them some text, stuff like that. The semantic stuff is really hard to like wrap your head around, especially at first. I remember years ago, I was an engineer on one of the teams that was working on some of that first replatforming stuff that we were doing to get over onto the first version of the player. When one of the architects in charge came and told me like, hey, we're going to do this, I looked at him and I was like, okay, cool. Well, how would I represent this? Because I was supposed to take one screen and make all of the assets to do the new screen. And he was like, well, don't think of it like a bunch of tiles. What is the semantic intent of those tiles? And I was like, I immediately hate this discussion. I don't want to have this discussion at all. I just want to get my job done. And so now that I'm the architect in charge of some of this stuff, I just view my current role as like punishment for how much crap I gave that architect.
And it's funny because that conversation never changes, right? Like even today, we still have everyone, coming and saying, hey, I have this design, like, how do I get it pixel perfect? And breaking up like this new experience into what are you actually trying to get, or what are you trying to accomplish? And then how do you build up all the Legos to get to the point where the end result is that experience, but also we can render a vastly different experience on a different platform or, to a different person. I think the question that, I don't know if it was David that started or someone else, but it was always like, what would Google Assistant, or I don't want to say the magic Alexa word because she's going to get triggered. What would that look like? Like, what would a voice version of this player look like? And that's kind of the semantic, target you're going after.
That was not me. How dare you?
Yeah, I've recently had to explain what the player is to a lot of people, and then the moment I say semantic content, like their eyes just like cross and they're like, wait, what happened? I kind of want to drill into that more. How do you arrive at that semantic content? Was there a committee? Is it just like random developers going off on their own? Like, how do you do it?
Yes to both of those. At various points, like definitely a committee in the early days, you'd sort of take a look at a screen, and this process really hasn't changed that much even today. Like you take a look at something that a PM or a designer, sketched together in Figma or Sketch or, Microsoft Paint, right? I mean, we don't actually use Paint to do all of our product prototypes, but you could. You take a look at that and you sort of look at each of the elements on the screen and you say like, okay, well, like we know how to represent some of these, but like if we need a new thing, we need to sort of take a step back and think if the design choice comes in for tiles, we need these tiles and they can be multi-selected or they can only be single selected or something like that. You have to sort of take a look at that and go, okay, divorce yourself from the fact that it's tiles. Adam joked about the Alexa player. Sorry, I'll try not to trigger your voice assistant, but
I got headphones on, so it's okay now. But only if I say it.
The way that you arrive at the semantic description of these things is just abstract away from the actual concrete implementation of each one of them and say like, okay, if we're asking the user to pick one of these tiles, that's a choice. And so it's no different than the drop down or the radio button or the set of checkboxes that we had in a different manifestation of the choice. And we're going to represent it that way with like a slight modifier. So you put like a type on it, or you put some other metadata that allows you to sort of distinguish between which type of choice you want the user to make. And then you leave it up to the platform, right? You can imagine a tile selection screen being like 4 wide and two or 3 high, and you've got just a bunch of grid tiles laid out in grid. But that wouldn't work on, say, a smaller form factor with a phone. That's why you want the semantic representation, is because that lets the platform implementations adhere to what the platform would expect. And so you're going to let the iOS engineer make the best choice for iOS and let the Android engineer make the best choice for Android, or let the Alexa engineer make the best choice for Alexa.
Makes a lot of sense. This reminds me of a way of the general practice when you're first building out a design system at a company. I don't think it's as like deep semantically as like far removed from the sort of UI.